introducing our speakers. We have two today, both co-authors of their recent publication, Arguments for Learning. Bill Cope is a professor in the Department of Education, Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His wife, Mary Calancis, recent research has focused on the development of digital writing and assessment technologies with the support of a number of major grants from the U.S. Department of Education, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the National Science Foundation. He has co-authored or co-edited with Mary Calancis New Learning Elements of a Science of Education, Literacies, and the 2-volume Grammar of Multimodal Meaning, Making Sense and Adding Sense. Our second speaker is Walter Feinberg. Walter came to the University of Illinois in 1967 and served in the Department of History and Philosophy of Education. His latest book, Educating for Democracy, makes the case that educating democratic citizens should be the function of all of the courses in the curriculum, from the arts to the humanities, from science to math. Recently, SUNY has published a collection of Walter's work over the last 50 years, edited by Brian Warnick. And now, I'll welcome our speakers, Bill and Walter.
Well, welcome everybody. It's good to be here. So this talk is about a book that we've recently put together, and in fact the history of it was kicked off by Mary Calancis when she was the Dean, who's here now, and I was the person who was the chair of the committee working on this. And then we worked on this for a while. We commissioned Wally then to start working on the draft. He did a lot of work, but then there were some areas where we thought things could be fleshed out a bit further, particularly around technology and education. And I then came in and did a whole lot of work after that. So that's really kind of the history of how we got to this. Wally kicked it off, then I came back and did things. And my proudest moments are the footnotes and the reference list and the index, right? But also I did a couple of chapters as well around technology and several other pieces as well. So it ended up being a huge amount of work, and here we are now, we've got this book. So what we're going to do is talk in a very informal kind of way. So we'll get Wally to come up here. Maybe we should put a couple of chairs up here so we can go backwards and forwards. Or maybe, Wally, if you want to stand with me, or
sure.
Yeah, let's do that. We'll put Wally up here on the throne. And then,
That's good.
so we've got some images here where we're going to just talk very informally to some images of people and things that happened in order to kind of give you a bit of a taste of what's in the book. Now, the QR code there, if you want to scan that, you can buy the book.
Am I in the way?
It's we're going to sell it now. It's remarkably cheap, 400 and something pages. It's a big book. A hardback is a mere $35. That's a bargain. So we're expecting tonight, with all the clicks on the QR code, there'll be some big sales tonight. No, I'm being facetious. The ebook's also pretty inexpensive. So, and we'll put that QR code up again at the end in case anybody's interested. But I'm going to start here with the first professor of education at the University of Illinois, which is Charles D'Agamo, 1890. And what's really interesting is that what he's saying there in that short quote was, for 1890, extremely progressive. You know, this was an era of very didactic pedagogy with professors and teachers all looking like that, actually. But this is admitting this new idea that the child has a will, and that a will to learn, and this should be harnessed. So this was, as I say, a pretty progressive idea for that time. Wally, your thoughts about Charles D'Agamo? Do you
Well, I think he was here for a very short time.
Only a short time, yeah.
Maybe a year, maybe 2 years.
Right.
He came, I believe, from Illinois State University.
Right.
And at this time, the department, education was a department, and it was in the College of Liberal Arts. And so the early part of the history is kind of a separating out that relationship. D'Agamo was very progressive.
Right.
I think he picked up a lot of social causes.
Yep.
His legacy was continued by many of the people that I worked with in history and philosophy of education, starting He left about a year later, but starting in the 1930s, the university began to hire a lot of people from Columbia who were they weren't Marxists, but they were on the lefty side of things. One of them was my professor at Boston University.
Right. Okay. Oh, what's happened? Is there a reason why this has gone out?
Question.
Okay, here we go. All right, so that's Degamo. This then becomes the first director of the School of Education. Now, the School of Education was founded in 1905, and one thing when Mary was dean that she was always very pleased about, it's one of the first to be founded in the university, and when they go through the stuff at convocation, it's right up the top of the list because a lot of other areas in the university were founded after that. So yes, he's founded in 1905. Anything about him, Wally? We just
No, I can't. No.
Right. Okay, we'll go on. When the school was first founded, it was in University Hall. Now, this University Hall is on the site of the current Union Building. This is the School of Education becomes the College of Education in 1916, and when it was there, it was in that building in University Hall. That building was demolished in 1938 and then replaced by the current building shortly after that. Now, in 1916, then, when the new college is founded, it's built. This is a purpose-built building for the College of Education. So this is now University High, and that was built in 1916. And then, moving on now, is that this is while it's still the College of Education. And then later on, it becomes a demonstration school. When the College of Education moves out later on, it becomes a demonstration school for all sorts of innovative things, like these particular sort of industrial arts things. Wally, any more news about this that you'd like to add?
Not really. Just that at the beginning, most of the students going through the college were being educated for secondary schools.
Right.
And that made sense because there was tie-ins with the liberal arts colleges, and the idea that also there was competition. I think there was a little bit of concern that we not step on the toes of Illinois State University at Normal. So for a while, we stayed out of the elementary teacher ed business, but that we picked up that later on.
Could I ask a question or no?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
You just mentioned University High School
Right.
was built for College of Education.
That's what it was built for. Yeah.
So I thought Edmund James, when he became president, the fifth president, he had 4 agendas, and one of them was to build University High School.
Right.
Never had school. So I'm a little bit confused. Was it built for high school, or was it built for college?
It was built for the College of Ed. Yeah. And later on, the high school moved in. Yeah.
I can't remember when Uni High was formed.
Yeah, that's kind of not in the book. We go into a little bit of detail, but not a lot because it's not a central part of the story. But it was used as a lab school initially to do experimental work. And look, one of the interesting things about these early years is Harold Rugg got his PhD in the College of Ed in 1915, and as Wally mentioned, a lot of these were kind of radically progressive educators, to be quite frank. So Rugg got his PhD in the College of Ed and then had quite a long career at Teachers College at Columbia University. And it actually ended up being, his books ended up, he produced a whole lot of textbooks. They ended up being almost banned.
They were
because
burnt.
They
were burnt by the American Legion
They were burnt
for
by the
being
American Legion.
subversive
And
in the 1940s.
I'll tell you what, this is what subversion looks like. Down the bottom is a conventional classroom, and he was advocating classrooms that look like that.
Right.
So he was a classic progressive educator.
Yeah.
And down the bottom it says, freedom, pupil initiative, activity, a life of happy intimacy. This is the drawing out environment of the new school. And below is eyes to the front, arms folded, sit still, pay attention, question and answer situations. This was the listening regime. So this is the frontispiece from a book that he wrote after he'd moved from here to Teachers College, Columbia. But he'd done his PhD here at the University of Illinois.
I may have mentioned my advisor had been Rugg's doctoral student at Teachers College.
Yeah, this is all about intellectual parentage and grandparentage and whatever. So yeah,
that's why I'm here, I think.
Yeah. The other thing which
question over
Oh,
here.
sorry. There's another question. Yes.
What books were burned by the American Legion?
Harold Rugg wrote a series of social studies textbooks, which were not, in today's terms, not hugely radical, to be quite frank. But he was a progressivist. And there was a really, really strong reaction against that. So his books eventually got virtually banned. So he had a big textbook series that was very, very successful on social studies. And then eventually, the opposition to them was such that he got sort of drummed out. There's a later version of this, which we'll come to later on with David Pearson and the reading wars, which we'll get to in a moment.
It's not unlike, just to add on, it's not unlike what's going on today with the reaction against critical race theory and that.
Or, emotional learning and all this kind of stuff. There's everything in education becomes political. We know that. One thing I'd like to mention as well is Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore was here on and off from 1912 to 1916. Why is he an important person? He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, 1914, I think it was. I don't remember the date off the top of my head. And he was here at Illinois when he learnt that he won the prize. So he was a very important Bengali poet, thinker, philosopher. And what he began, he'd sent his sons here. So this is him and this is his son. He sent one son here to do an undergraduate degree, then another son here to do a PhD at the University of Illinois. That's why I was here when and he spent periods of time here, gave lectures here and whatever. But then this very famous school that he set up in Bengal called the Shantikant School, which is, and he wrote kind of about progressivism and about how you build an agricultural education which is close to the land and close to the people who farm the land. So a very, very interesting person, and in India an important person. There he is with Mahatma Gandhi. So, but it's kind of interesting that in a way some of his formative ideas were created while he was here, in the years he was here in Illinois. Even he was only here by virtue of the connections with his sons that were here.
Just a footnote, I guess. Mahatma Gandhi's grandson was teaching at the University of Illinois for a number of years. I think he's now retired.
Yeah. He's in the book too, by the way. And while he was here, he wrote some really important stuff. And he came into our college for a while.
Yeah.
So, we mentioned that in the book. And look, I can see you're here, Beth. Thanks for helping us turn some of this up. Beth works in the Bureau of Education Research. And this was founded in there in 1918. And began the Journal of Education Research, which was really the first education research journal, as far as I can tell. It became the official organ of the National Association of Directors of Educational Research, which later became the American Educational Research Association. And B.R. Buckingham, who was one of the early directors, was a really important person in the establishment of that. It's funny, this week Mary and I have been preparing for courses that begin in a few weeks, and we're redoing some videos, and I'm reading a whole lot of stuff about Thorndike, the great educational psychologist. Well, B.R. Buckingham appears all the time in the same collections as Thorndike. So anyhow, this is, now what Buckingham does is he sets up a very, very effective business, and that's a business creating tests, which was lucrative and effective. And the university really, and by the way, funded the Bureau of Education Research. The university was, thought, oh, we shouldn't be doing commercial things, and effectively told them to shut it down. So he then left, and the Bureau after then struggled to get funding in the years after that. Beth, does that tally with your kind of understanding?
Yes, it is. He moved to Ohio State University.
Right.
Founded another Bureau of Educational Research there.
Right.
And they went on, and he was selling tests when they were also writing curriculum. They didn't have publishing companies like we do now, so they were...
And tremendously influential. So in a way, it was a president who just didn't like what they were doing, who kind of forced them out.
First in the country.
Yeah, it was for, this is really important foundational stuff.
So, hold on. Did you say the university president did not like this?
Yes.
So
He didn't like the fact that they had a very, very lucrative business selling tests. Selling, so one of the big things the early researchers did was think about testing and evaluation and all those kinds of things, and they built tests and they sold them, and it made a lot of money. So today, who makes a pile of money out of tests? Educational Testing Service, and there are companies now which are hugely lucrative around the assessment market. Well, this was a leader in that, and also lucrative as well.
Yeah, because at that time, president was Edmund James.
Yeah, I don't remember the book. The president that
Here's even the date. Edmund James was
Right.
1904 to 1920.
Yep.
And
Well, it might have been the new president after 1920 which meant there was a regime change, and that's when Buckingham left. Going on now, the university has had a hugely influential role in the development of educational psychology as a field. This is one of the most famous people, Lee Cronbach. What often happens, and Cronbach's a good example of it, he came here because he had a lot of children and they made him a good deal, and
he wanted them to go to uni high.
And he wanted them to go to uni high, so that's why he came here. But then he becomes incredibly famous as somebody who builds a set of tests which are still used today around validity, statistical, psychometric stuff. And then he goes to University of California, Berkeley, if I'm not wrong. After a while, he doesn't stay here, but his foundational work.
I think that's right.
Happens when he's here. Again, the details are all in the book. But again, what he's doing is building these statistical methods. So this is, experimental method, correlational method. So building statistical measures in psychometrics, and he was a leader in the psychometrics area.
One might add that he was also a leader in arguing against sort of scientific racism, and he had the technical skills to be able to do that.
And actually, he became president of the American Psychological Association,
Right.
and then later in his career was very, very controversial because what he did is he ran a critique of mechanistic statistical work. And it's a profound, no, obviously that's what he did, but what he was arguing has to be tempered in all these kinds of ways. And then all the people who are in that space were rather kind of rattled that somebody who was a leader should be critical of some of the consequences of these kinds of statistical processes. So I'm just going through a number of people who are in the book who are important players and the kind of intellectual work they did. This is another one, a very controversial person. Whose name's Siegfried Engelmann, who created this direct instruction system, which was very, very controversial, this highly scripted instruction. So in fact, he started in philosophy at the U of I, and what he wanted to do is build these very rigorous scripted dialogues between teachers and students, which became DISTAR, highly directive in kind of didactic pedagogy. This picture on the right here is, believe it or not, I don't know whether you might remember this image, but I'll tell you the image. On September 11th, 2001 at 9:40 or something or other, somebody came and whispered in George Bush's ear that the Twin Towers had been hit. Now George stays in the classroom, and what's the teacher doing in the classroom? She's demonstrating DISTAR. So in other words, this is how influential the whole thing was. He eventually left here. He worked with Karl Bereiter and other people here who also left and became very, very, were very, very important people, to be quite frank. And then this method then became very, very controversial because it was so teacher-centered, scripted curriculum, which didn't even really trust the teacher, to be quite frank.
Well, also, it was also directed towards poor kids and black kids.
Right.
And there was a feeling that it was kind of reinforcing racism.
Right. Yes, exactly. So on the one hand, being directed to poor kids and black kids was in the vision of Karl Bereiter and Siegfried Egelmann was giving them educational access. So their own explanation was that these kids don't do very well. We've got to help them do well at school. We'll, in a kind of a vernacular today, it's called drill and kill, right? We'll drill them like mad, and they'll do better at school. So, but in retrospect, it's highly problematic. But nevertheless, this direct instruction curriculum of his still alive and still being used. And as a matter of fact, Mary and I, we're from Australia, and it's being some Aboriginal communities in Australia, remote Aboriginal communities, and their leaders say this is what we've got to have to get our kids up to speed, for better or for worse. So again, that's a kind of this is then, people around the world talk about direct instruction in these critical ways and sometimes in positive ways, but in a way, what's happened now with the return in the reading wars is there's a return to this. Sorry, this has gone off again. Why did it do that? It's falling asleep. Is there someone?
Back up. There it goes.
There it is.
Yes, this is still being played out today, this debate. Okay, anything else about that?
Well, just that to me, I'm an outsider to the reading situation, but the reading wars always seem to me to be somewhat contrived in the sense that I don't know of a method that's taught by either side that isn't significant and workable in some context and in some ways, but when you try to generalize it and make it into a whole theory of how to teach reading to everybody or any group of people, it becomes very problematic. But the wars make a lot of professors wealthy. Keeps the business going.
The next big thing is Samuel Kirk, who is regarded as one of the key people who invented the field of special education. So special education back then, I don't know whether it's the case now, involved anybody who sits outside what would be defined as a normal spectrum. And normal's a very problematic term, so all these terms have changed. And as a matter of fact, I had a number of wars with the editors of the book who didn't like me using the original historical terms around disadvantage and disability. And I said, look, these were the terms they used. Anyhow, they won the argument. They took out everything which was historical. I'm just trying to think of the words now, but anyhow, they edited it out. But anyhow, but what's radical about this work is that at both ends of the spectrum, there were what was called exceptional children. There were children who were had various forms of disability. At the other end, there was this idea of gifted and talented. So neither of those populations were well served in generic down the middle of the line education. And in a way, what's very radical about this idea is simply the idea that learners are different. That's a really radical idea, which hadn't been thought about to any great degree in education before, because what you would do is you'd stream kids, you'd make them repeat, you'd do all sorts of things on the rigorous assumption that students are going to be normal, the same. Whereas what this was about was creating dedicated instruction for, for children who sat outside that spectrum. So Samuel Kirk was very big in doing that, and then built a very strong relationship with the federal government and got some very substantial grants to build out this work.
I think it was also, if I'm right, I remember right, a time when Kennedy was in office.
Right.
And the Kennedys had one sibling who was cognitively challenged.
Right.
So I think they were very receptive
Right.
to this kind of work.
Yep, that's true.
He was Secretary of Education for a while, right? He went to Washington, he was appointed.
Who,
Kirk, yeah.
Yeah.
oh, was he?
I don't remember that.
And he coined the term learning disability.
Right.
Right,
Sort
right.
of looking at the spectrum, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
something
I don't,
very
it's interesting, I don't remember.
I knew he was very closely involved in things Washington, so yeah. Again, since we wrote the book, which is how many pages, some of the details of
We forgot.
can't answer off the top of our head. We got to go and look it up
It
ourselves.
was a while ago, too.
Right. The next thing here is the construction of the College of Education, which is a good story in its own right, in that after the Sputnik scare, 58, if I'm not wrong, that was the year of Sputnik, there was this idea, well, goodness me, the Russians are getting ahead of us, and they were actually, we'd better invest a lot in education, particularly science and education of all kinds. So this became the impetus behind the construction of the College of Ed. And what happened was they commissioned a professor, a long-term professor in the School of Architecture, Richard Williams, to build a design. And it was a Sputnik type design. It's, I like the design actually. It's a really beautiful kind of modernist early 60s design. It was opened in 1963, took a few years to build, and it was meant to be a pair of buildings. You can see here Dick's original, and it was never big enough, so bits of the College of Ed are still strewn all over the place. So Dick's original vision was the second building over there, which was a kind of a mirror of the first, and this courtyard affair in the middle with a kind of an amphitheatre. An interesting thing is when Mary became dean, Dick was by then had been retired for 24 years and he was 94. We found him in Arizona and she brought him back to build a model of how we might finish his original vision with another building, which was actually a little bit like this, with this amphitheatre in the middle. Anyhow, the College of Education building then is a kind of a defining thing, and what's interesting is the fact that it's in contrast to all the other neo-Georgian stuff around the place. Right. And it was a controversial thing to do, to build a modernist building between these kind of neo-Georgian buildings.
And that second building was never built?
Never built. It's now a parking lot.
I think the college is still breathing. You can get the other building.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
What is it now?
It's a parking lot.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Right.
So why it wasn't built? It was designed.
No, they were going to build one and then build another one later on, and then it never happened. And partly because how many rich people are there as donors in education? How many school teachers can throw in $10 million or $20 million or $50 million to build a building? So the Siebel mob, of course, they're going to get a pile of money, and the Geese mob are going to get a pile of money, because if you've been a successful engineer or a successful business person, you're going to have a pile of money. There's no successful school teacher that could
It
afford
speaks to a wider
pay for
issue,
building.
which isn't something we need to get into, but how universities finance their growth.
Yeah.
One interesting side note, just for Richard Williams, we recently co-hosted a mid-century modern house tour with the Cranard Art Museum, and Richard Williams' home was featured on that tour.
Right.
He was a very important architect here and fought for this. He really fought to create this building. But as Bill says, education was important during the Sputnik time, but now education is here.
Yeah.
Technology, science is up there, and the money that gets
Now, to be a little bit contemporary, and now the Chinese are beating his hands down. So I saw an interesting statistic the other day about the number of published peer review articles, and the Chinese are way ahead of the US now. They've been way ahead on patents too for a while. So perhaps instead of, I'll say this anyhow, perhaps instead of tariffs, we should be investing in education. That's how to beat the Chinese. Interesting statistic as well, by the way, 50%, which I only saw the other day, 50% of all published AI articles are Chinese, 50%. So And that means that a lot of them are European and a lot of them are all sorts of other things. So a lot of them are Indian, but 50% Chinese.
We probably trained a good many of them.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's another really important kind of story in the place as well. Also, you know, this is a place where there's been a huge amount of controversy over the years. These were protests during the Vietnam War. Interestingly, this was a rally held by the Communist Party of the United States on the lawn. I just wonder whether that would happen again if we were to run. I can imagine some things we could run rallies about now, and could we run them? Don't just look on the news and think, could we run a rally about any of those topics? Probably not. And what they did is, of course, they brought troops onto campus. Nobody got killed here, unlike Kent State, but this was a time of great controversy. And the Clover Act was a state law, which actually one of our alums, Courtney Kasdan, had opposed back in the McCarthy period, but it was still in the books, which restricted free speech. So the kind of the arguments now about free speech, they're not at all new, but
they, as bad as the times were, they weren't doing what they are doing now, picking out students and arresting them and putting them away that you don't know where they are. Things were happening, but it wasn't that bad.
So you're saying things are worse now?
I think things are worse.
Things
now.
are much worse.
Yeah.
Things are much worse now.
I mean, imagine arresting a mayor candidate and a senator. And
Right. No, not good. Sorry, this keeps going out. Hope it comes back on again in a second. There it is. Okay. And this is, now the next thing we should mention is Project 500. So this was an elite, privileged white institution even in the mid-60s. So one rather radical thing in 1968 was to bring 500 African American students in, to consciously recruit 500 African American students. It produced controversy, including this here on the left. You can see police arresting a number of the students during a protest, but nevertheless it was a kind of... Now those 500 students then went on to be very kind of influential people, to be quite frank, all around the country. So yeah, we were far from immune from controversy there. Anything about... You were here during all of that.
Oh yeah. I mean, one of the students went on, Jim Anderson went on to be a dean of the college.
Right.
And another student went
Actually,
on.
Jim came before 68. So the 500...
He was here though.
He was already here, yeah.
He was still here.
Yep.
And then there was the president of the University of Maryland in Baltimore. I think he was here at that time. He was here,
yep. Trying to think of his name now. Do you remember his name? The man?
Freeman-Hrabowski.
That's who it is. Good on you. Thank goodness you're here, Beth. This is just my machine going to sleep every now and then. Okay. All right. So change of gear, technology. Plato was the world's first technology-mediated or computer-mediated learning system, 1959. And the cultural reference over here is HAL 9000 in 2001. As HAL dies, HAL says, "Take me back to Urbana," because HAL was built at a fictional company based in Urbana called the Illinois Computing Company or something or other. So it's a kind of iconic place. Anyhow, Plato's a really incredible thing where, in fact, what happens is because it was educational application, this was the first machine which built a kind of a language-based interface into the computer. Before that, computers only did calculation. It was the first plasma screen, and it was actually a touch screen, to be quite frank, which was digitizing images on a two-dimensional plane so that you could have both image and text on the same screen. They were remarkable inventions, to be quite frank. And the interesting thing is that they were all ancillary to an educational invention. The first emojis ever, the first actually person-to-person messaging was through these computers, student to student. So it's a crazy history. 1959, and eventually it ended. It was killed by microcomputers and mini computers in the 1970s. But the irony is now with cloud computing, we've gone back to exactly the same model. So this was a terminal here linked to a mainframe, and there were multiple terminals. So it was the cloud computing model, if you like. Personal computers killed it in the 70s, but the irony is we're back to that space.
Is that what the cloud is?
That's what the cloud is. It's actually architecturally just the same, to be quite, which is really kind of interesting that we've returned to that. One story that I like, by the way, because it's just a cute kind of Cold War story. The people here who did this, actually Don Blitzer died a few weeks ago, who was the key person behind it. They took it all around the world, and they sold it to South Africa, they sold it to Australia, all sorts of places took it up because it was revolutionary, and they took it to Moscow. And one story that I really like is when they took it to Moscow. By the way, when they took it to Moscow, one of the people who was snooping around looking at it was somebody by the name of Boris Yeltsin, who at that time was a governor in Yekaterinburg, in the edge of the Urals. So anyhow, he was one of the people that was there. But anyhow, what happens is when they were going, the CIA told the U of I people, do not under any circumstances say that it's possible to communicate device to device and to monitor that communication, because that's exactly what this was the first computer system where you could do that. Do not under any circumstances say that. And of course, when they got to Moscow, the very first question the Russians asked is, can you do that? Well, the answer is you could. So this was the beginning of surveillance systems which were based on the networking of computers. So, and that's kind of in the terms of the history of humanity, pretty darn amazing. And the fact that it was, firstly, that the U of I was so early in the job, ahead of everybody else. But secondly, that's actually very recent. That's not very long ago. Now, this is kind of two versions of Plato here. One is this kind of logical model about learning, and you see correct answer. In fact, ironically, it took us back to everything that Harold Rugg was criticising, which was this highly mechanical behaviourist views, problem, answer, yes, no, error detector, help, yes. So what it was the first version of computer-mediated, this was an electronic tutor system. This is what these are called these days. So in a way, that's profoundly important. But on the right here, there are also these protests, and eventually it was taken out of the university because of all the protests you saw before, because in fact, of course, these were always part of the military-industrial complex. So eventually they moved the computer to California. And by the way, I'm going to get you to say something. You were there at the protest. So tell us about this Smash the Iliac 4.
Well, there was remember, it's during the Vietnam War.
Right.
So you have to rebuild that context and the anger around the massacres going on in Vietnam. In the middle of that, the university signs a contract with the Defense Department for the fastest computer in the world.
Iliac 4.
Iliac 4. And then some of the lefty faculty, including yours truly, got upset about it and protested it in the university senate, and the project was killed.
So Iliac was the back end of Plato. It was the mainframe on which Plato was the terminal and the software and the programming, but the mainframe was Iliac. Iliac 1 initially back in 1959, but by the time we got here, Iliac 4. And so these were the kind of confluence of things that produced the end.
One other thing, if we could go back, you skipped over Project 500. The background story to that is that happens a year after Martin Luther King's assassination, and protests all over the country, including here and in Chicago. And so then the university makes a commitment to bring in 500 African American students, whereas at the time, the numbers of African American students that were here, I think you could count on
negligible,
the fingers of both hands, maybe.
Yep.
So it's you have to keep in mind the historical background. These things don't just sort of fly out of a professor's head and onto the screen. There is stuff going on, political stuff military stuff,
Right.
social stuff. I mean, so all of this is part of the story.
Yep.
And an active Ku Klux Klan, wasn't there at the time?
Yeah, there was
Yes,
a
I
Ku
mean,
Klux
I
Klan
have,
on the university, yeah.
when I first started teaching here in 1967, I had a student, McCullum, African American. He was the first African American person who was appointed a principal of a Champaign school. And he told me that when he first came to that school and he opened up his desk, there was a Bible in it that had been donated by the KKK. And that was the atmosphere that was going on. Martin Luther King was assassinated while I was teaching a course, and one of my students said he got what he deserved. So, you have to reconstruct that kind of atmosphere to understand how these things are important. They're not just important for their own sake. They're important because they fit in to a larger, significant cultural, political context.
This is one aspect of technology development here which I find particularly interesting. So this is a conference at Allerton in 1960, but the whole world of cybernetics was invented here. Now, what ended up beating cybernetics was this thing called artificial intelligence. And the difference between these ideas is John McCarthy, and Marvin Minsky was at MIT, they had this idea of artificial intelligence, which is we can build a machine which is intelligent like a human. The cybernetics idea was different. We can build feedback relationships. So cyber means feedback relationships. And it was really a really important kind of set of events. Warren McCulloch here, fifth row from the right, back row. Warren McCulloch was the person who, a U of I professor in Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago, who got the idea that the brain operates with on-off things. There are neurons which are excited and not excited, and therefore you could build a binary system. John von Neumann, who invented the first one of these computers, EDVAC, and by the way, ILIAC was a version of EDVAC, got this idea, okay, let's run in base 2. Let's run this on binaries because we can do that with electricity. If that's why the brain works, let's model the computer on the brain. A really revolutionary idea and a very flawed idea. It's a long story how complicated that idea is, but it's still with us in the idea of neural nets and all these things. That's Warren McCulloch. One thing, these are all very, very important people in the cybernetics universe. One person I want to point out here is Friedrich Hayek. So Friedrich Hayek has the bow tie there in the middle. There he is there. He was there. And Friedrich Hayek becomes one of the most important economists of all time. He's actually at the University of Chicago at the time, but he then creates what became then the neoliberal economy. He becomes a consultant to Margaret Thatcher, to Ronald Reagan, and that paradigm actually wins. That economic paradigm wins. But it's interesting, here at the U of I in 1960, trying to think about these models of feedback systems, which he then translated into the market. Well, what I want to show you is, in contrast to that, is Stafford Beer, fourth row, blah, 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 blah. Stafford Beer was an English management consultant who had the opposite idea, that we could use these systems to run a planned economy. And he ended up going to Chile when Allende was the president and building a computerized system for a planned economy. So what you've got is
But then, just one of Hayek's students, the University of Chicago, the name escapes me, you know it, goes to Chile and becomes the advisor. What's it?
Milton Friedman.
Milton Friedman becomes the advisor to Pinochet, who's the dictator.
Right.
And that's neat.
But cybernetics is an idea around learning. It's around feedback systems through which machines can learn and humans can learn with systems, with computers. I mean, so anyhow, that's a crazy intellectual history where there's that's one of the chapters that I added to the manuscript. Max Baberman, do you want to speak about him a little bit, Wally?
Well, just at the time, this would be the mid-1950s, and Sputnik, the Soviets launched Sputnik. There's a big panic in the United States. Why aren't we educating students so that they can build Sputniks? And then they conclude that we need more science and more math. Max Biberman at the time was a pretty young professor who, along with some other people, developed something called the new math. And the new math was supposed to, instead of just teaching kids that 6 times 6 is whatever it is, you teach them the concepts behind the math so that they have the capacity to reason mathematically. And Biberman was still here when I came. He died died very young, but he was the father of that, and it went all over the country. And then there was a huge backlash because people didn't feel that their children were learning math. They didn't know how to multiply, they didn't know how to divide, right. They didn't know how to subtract or add. I mean, that's an exaggeration. But there was a huge backlash because the math that these kids were learning was different than the math their parents had learned. And also, it's hard for teachers to learn how to teach this stuff.
Right, yeah. So it was, kind of very influential in a way, but also controversial. And there was, with every one of these things, there's a kind of reaction against it. So there was a conservative reaction against what he was saying and against the new math. Theoretically, what he was doing was bringing to conventional math set theory and logic, right? So he actually had a kind of a deep set of philosophical commitments. But then what he did was, again, it was about building a conceptual understanding of math rather than just learning how to get the answers right.
And so each one of these vignettes, though, influenced the whole of America and countries outside of
right,
America.
Around the world.
Sexual education,
Yep.
new math,
Yep.
they were enormously significant.
Okay, so what I did now is, as part of this research, I went back into, people might know Wayback Machine, which has an archive of the old web. So I went back into Wayback Machine and I found the original promotional material for the world's first fully online graduate degree in 1998. And in fact, Mary and I are still teaching this degree. It doesn't have the same name anymore. It's called Learning, Design and Leadership. But this was this program called Curriculum, Teaching and Educational Reform. That's what CTR standard for. So it was teaching about technology and using technology to do it, and it was the first fully. The LEAP program in library science was a little bit earlier, but that had a residential component. You had to come for a week or two to a conference. So I'm going to go through a few deans now. Here, just more recent history. This is people that folks in the community might know. Mildred Griggs was the first African American to be dean of the college, 1995 to 2000. Here are 3 more recent deans: Susan Fowler, David Pearson, and Mary, who's here. David Pearson, by the way, became a very important player in what's now the reading wars. So he came here and with Dick Anderson worked in the Centre for the Study of Reading, where they were built kind of a cognitive psychology of reading, where they were very much focused on schemas of meaning that are in your mind, which is, in other words, if I'm going to do something about read a menu, I've got to understand restaurants and the schema of the restaurant to understand the text of a menu. So it was about meaning in text, whereas the reading wars these days say just drill phonics because that's all you need. And David was dean here until 1995. He left from here. He was here for 17 years. Then what he did is, after that, he went to be dean of the College of Education at the University of California.
He wasn't dean for 17 years, though.
No, he wasn't a dean. He was here for 17 years. But then he went to become dean at the College of Education at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's still engaged in the reading wars. not in a way which is kind of doctrinaire, but just saying, okay, we've got to balance these things, phonics, and for example, and text, the meaning of texts. Then more recent deans, Mary again, Christala, who's the current dean, Jim Anderson, who was the dean for a few years, 6 years or so, who followed on from Mary, and then Susan Fowler, who was a special ed person, who was that was her main area of work. And we're quite near the end now, but I thought what I might do near the end is get Wally to tell you a bit about himself, because Wally's one of the most published people in the college, incredibly prolific over all the years. And of course, here's Wally, young Wally here, keeps writing books. This is his latest book, Cambridge University Press. That's impressive, Wally.
Thank you. I don't have a lot to add. I'm sorry. What's that?
Oh, she wants you to go to the microphone.
I have one here, I believe. Can you hear me?
No, it's for the recording, but it doesn't matter. They can hear you anyhow. You're good.
Yeah, if you can't, I'll go up there. I was just trying to recall, I mean, as a lot of what I said about context, political, social, economic, is what I would say. I was trying to think of the Project 500, that I mentioned, of the African American students coming here. It was poorly planned. I actually taught, I actually initiated what I think was the most successful part of the teaching program at the time, because we thought it through. And the kids that came, many of them came from the inner city. And many of them had issues and problems that you simply don't encounter with the normal everyday college student. One student lived in a gang-infested area, but his younger brother was there. The apartment house was one gang. The brother had to walk through another gang to get to school. So and what we noticed, I had an excellent African-American teaching assistant. And what he pointed out to me was that every time these kids went back to vacation, they came back very agitated, because they went back to family situations or household situations which were difficult. And so if you didn't address that, you weren't really addressing their needs. But a lot of the college's importance eventually comes to that quote by D'Agamo, that there are 30 wills in the class. There are also 30 people that have different understandings. And that a teacher's job is not just to present that knowledge as if you're presenting it to the same thing. You have to understand what the kids are bringing to the engagement. So, for example, one of the big innovations of the Reading Center was not just schemata, and you teach kids, you understand what kind of schemata the kids bring with them to the classroom. And then you understand what they need to learn in order to get. I mean, you imagine going into a restaurant and you don't know what a menu is. And you're just confronted with, black and white marks. So the idea, the college's, I think, big contribution, if you look at it as a whole, which is really tough to do, is that it opened up the idea that children don't come as blank slates to the classroom. They come with their own understanding, and to be an effective teacher, you need to work with that understanding.
So, while he's still writing about these fundamental issues, and I can't believe that there's another book after this, so there you go. Meanwhile, Mary and I are working in this kind of AI space now. So that's our people in our lab down the bottom here on the right, and we're building a kind of an AI-informed workspace. This is a huge set of transitions going on, and we have a lab which we call the Cyber Social Learning Lab, this is not about artificial intelligence replicating the machine, replicating human intelligence. It's about how we build these machine-human relationships which help us to learn and to think. So that's what we're doing. So that's kind of the end of what we're doing. As I say, there's a QR code there if you want to get a copy. It's actually Wally has one copy of it if you want to have a look at it. It's very nicely produced, and all these pictures are from the book. So I just sort of pulled this slide.
U of I Press did a great job.
U of I Press did a very nice job with it.
Thank you.